The man thought he had lived alone for years, but an alien woman was watching him. Lincoln woke to the sound of the air recycler dying again, which meant today was a Thursday, or a Tuesday. Time had become more of a philosophical suggestion than a concrete measurement out here at the edge of everything, where the nearest human being was roughly 100 light years away, and the nearest decent cup of coffee was significantly farther. He rolled out of his bunk with the practiced grace of a man who'd forgotten why he used to care about dignity, scratched places that didn't particularly itch, and shuffled toward the kitchenette in his underwear and one sock. The station didn't judge. The station had seen worse. "Morning, sweetheart," he said to the coffee synthesizer, giving it an affectionate pat that was probably more superstition than maintenance. "Let's not fight today, okay? I know you're capable of better." The machine gurgled ominously, which Lincoln had learned to interpret as grudging cooperation. A moment later, it produced something that was technically coffee in the same way that processed nutrient paste was technically food. He took a sip, grimaced, and took another. 5 years had taught him that standards were just expectations waiting to disappoint you. The air recycler coughed again from somewhere in the wall, a wet mechanical sound that suggested it was contemplating early retirement. Lincoln sighed into his terrible coffee and made a mental note to check the filters. Again. He checked them 3 days ago, or maybe a week ago. The recycler didn't care about his maintenance schedule anymore than he cared about wearing matching socks. He pulled on his coveralls, the ones with Frontier Survey Corps stenciled across the back in letters that had faded to a suggestion, and headed toward the command module. The station stretched around him in its familiar configuration of corridors and bulkheads, all soft lighting and recycled air, a metal bubble of survival clinging to the void like a barnacle with delusions of grandeur. His morning routine was sacred in the way that all routines become sacred when you're the only person around to care about them. Check the atmospheric processors, functioning within normal parameters, which meant they were slowly degrading, but not yet catastrophically. Review the quantum relay logs, still receiving data from the survey drones, still finding absolutely nothing interesting in this sector, still justifying his employment by the thinnest possible margin. Verify hull integrity. The station remained impressively committed to keeping space on the outside. "Another thrilling day in paradise," Lincoln announced to the empty command module. He'd long since stopped feeling self-conscious about talking to himself. When you're alone long enough, the inside of your head gets crowded, and some of those thoughts need to be evicted into the air just to make room. The communication console blinked with its daily automated check-in from Frontier Command. A message that boiled down to, "Still alive?" Lincoln typed back his daily response, which boiled down to, "Unfortunately." The message would take 6 weeks to reach anyone who might read it. The response would take another 6 weeks to come back. He'd receive it long after he'd forgotten what he'd asked. He pulled up the survey data from the overnight drone sweeps, scrolling through columns of measurements that all said the same thing in slightly different numerical languages. Empty, empty, still empty, surprisingly empty, empty with a side of nothing. This sector was supposed to hold something interesting. The preliminary scans had suggested unusual energy signatures, potential signs of rare mineral deposits, maybe even remnants of ancient civilizations. Instead, it held the cosmic equivalent of a vacant lot. No minerals, no ruins, no civilizations, ancient or otherwise, just a whole lot of dark matter being spectacularly boring. Lincoln leaned back in his chair, which squeaked in protest. Everything on the station squeaked, hummed, or rattled. It was like living inside a mechanical orchestra that only knew one song, and that song was entropy. "You know what we need?" he said to the command console. "We need excitement, drama, maybe a small emergency that's interesting but not fatal. Something to write home about." The console wisely didn't respond. What Lincoln didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that in the maintenance tunnel directly beneath his feet, someone was listening, her skin pale as starlight, her long ears pressed flat against her skull in concentration. Arya held her breath and waited for him to move on. She'd been watching him through the camera feeds for so long that his routines had become her routines, his schedule the framework of her days. She knew he was about to check the air recycler. She'd loosened the filter housing 3 days ago, just enough to make it complain. It gave him something to do, kept him occupied in the western corridors while she moved through the eastern ones. Arya had arrived on a Tuesday, though she hadn't known it was Tuesday, and wouldn't have cared if she had. Her ship had been screaming through the void with 3 engines dead, and the 4th making sounds that no engine should make. Sounds that suggested it was composing a suicide note in mechanical language. The stellar anomaly had come out of nowhere, a pocket of twisted space-time that the sensors had mistaken for background radiation until they were already inside it. And by then the distinction between mistake and catastrophe had become academic. She'd lost Thomas first when the porthole breached, then Kira when the life support failed in the aft compartment. Chen had made it almost to the end, helping her plot a course toward the only structure their dying sensors could detect before the radiation poisoning took him. She'd wrapped his body in thermal sheets and sealed the compartment, because that's what you did, because the rituals mattered even when nothing else did. The station had appeared on her screens like a miracle made of metal and lights, a research outpost broadcasting automated maintenance signals into the empty dark. Single occupancy, the identification beacon declared. 1 human technician. Standard survey configuration. Arya had moved to trigger the emergency dock request, her fingers already reaching for the communication array, when the computer had helpfully informed her that unauthorized personnel would initiate automatic quarantine protocols. She'd stared at that message for a long time, her ears flat against her skull, her mind doing calculations that all ended in the same place. Quarantine meant sealed compartments. Sealed compartments meant she'd be locked away from the station's main systems, locked away from food, from fabricators, from any chance of repairing her ship. She'd be trapped in a box waiting for rescue that might take months, assuming anyone came at all, assuming the single occupant even bothered to file the proper reports. So she'd made a different choice. The station's docking cradle had external maintenance access, designed for repair drones and emergency hull patches. Arya was neither a drone nor a patch, but she was desperate, and desperate made you creative. She'd matched the station's rotation, killed her remaining engine, and drifted close enough to pop the maintenance hatch with an emergency override that probably violated a dozen safety regulations. Getting inside had been the easy part. Not being detected had required significantly more effort. She'd spent the first week mapping the station's interior through its own security feeds, learning the blind spots in the camera coverage, the gaps in the motion sensors. The place was designed for a crew of 5, but operated by one extremely lonely human who talked to his coffee maker and occasionally sang to the atmospheric processors. He had no reason to suspect an intruder. Why would he? They were 100 light years from anything. The maintenance tunnels became her domain, the forgotten spaces between the walls where the station's mechanical guts lived. She'd found the old storage compartment in the secondary hub, a room that had been sealed off when the station configuration changed from crew rotation to single occupancy. Someone had left behind a spare bunk, some storage lockers, even a small fabricator that still worked if you didn't mind it making concerning noises. Arya had minded at first, but she'd gotten over it. She learned to move in the gaps of Lincoln's routine. When he checked the eastern corridors, she worked in the western ones. When he slept, she ventured into the common areas, carefully stealing food packets from stores he'd never noticed missing, routing power to her compartment through secondary systems he never monitored. She became a ghost in the machine, invisible and essential, and she watched him. God help her, she watched him. At first it had been pure survival, learning his patterns to avoid detection. But somewhere in the second month it became something else. Curiosity maybe, companionship of a sort. She learned that he hummed when he was focused, that he swore creatively at malfunctioning equipment, that he did a little dance when he successfully repaired something complicated. She learned that he was lonely in a way that made her chest ache, that he talked to himself because the alternative was silence, that he'd been out here so long he'd forgotten how to be around anyone else. She told herself she was doing him a favor by staying hidden. What would he do if he found her? Panic, probably. Trigger those quarantine protocols. Trap them both in bureaucratic hell while they waited for some official to decide what to do about an unauthorized alien living in the walls. Better to stay a secret. Better to be a helpful ghost. She'd started small, tightening a loose panel here, replacing a worn gasket there, always in the places he wouldn't immediately notice. The station ran a little better with two people maintaining it, even if one of those people didn't officially exist. She fixed things he didn't even know were broken. Sometimes she wondered what would happen if she just walked up to him in the corridor, said hello like a normal person. Would he scream? Probably. Would he believe she'd been here for years? Almost certainly not. The idea made her ears twitch with something that might have been amusement. Lincoln stood in the middle of the supply room, staring at the inventory screen with the expression of a man whose grip on reality had become negotiable. The numbers didn't match. Again. For the third time this month, his consumption logs showed discrepancies that made no mathematical sense unless he developed sleepwalking habits that included midnight snacking on nutrient bars he didn't remember eating. Okay, he said to the shelves of supplies. I'm either losing my mind or you've developed opinions about proper stock rotation. The shelves, maintaining professional neutrality, declined to comment. He'd first noticed it 2 weeks ago when his favorite coffee substitute, a brand that tasted slightly less like despair than the alternatives, had run out faster than expected. He'd blamed his own miscalculation, maybe a data entry error. But then the nutrient bars started disappearing. Then the medical supplies showed a deficit of basic bandages. Small things, easily explained things, except they kept happening. Lincoln ran a hand through his hair, which had reached the length where it had stopped being a haircut and started being a lifestyle choice. Computer, run a diagnostic on inventory tracking systems. The station's AI, which had the personality of a particularly efficient filing cabinet, responded immediately. All inventory systems functioning within normal parameters. No errors detected. Yeah, that's what I was afraid you'd say. He walked back to his quarters where his coffee mug, the sacred vessel emblazoned with Galaxy's okayest technician, was sitting on his desk. Exactly where he'd left it, except he distinctly remembered leaving it in the command module. He'd set it down next to the navigation console while he reviewed the morning data. He was absolutely certain of this. And yet here it was, back in his room like it had developed teleportation capabilities. Nope, Lincoln said firmly. Nope, nope, nope. We're not doing this. There's a rational explanation. He spent the next hour checking the station's environmental sensors for signs of microgravity fluctuations that might cause objects to drift. Nothing. He reviewed the maintenance logs for evidence of hull integrity issues that might create localized pressure differentials. Also, nothing. He even, in a moment of desperation he'd later deny under oath, searched the database for documented cases of space-induced hallucinations. The results were not encouraging. By evening cycle, he'd developed a working theory that involved quantum entanglement, observer effect paradoxes, and the possibility that 5 years of isolation had finally broken something important in his brain. He sat in the command module, drinking synthesized tea that tasted like someone's vague memory of plants, and contemplated the philosophical implications of potentially going insane. The thing about losing your mind, he told the navigation console, is that the person losing it is probably the last one qualified to judge. It's a real design flaw in the whole consciousness thing. That's when he heard it, a sound from the maintenance access corridor, a soft scraping like someone, or something, moving carefully through the confined space. Lincoln froze, tea halfway to his lips. The station had sounds, of course. It creaked and groaned like an old house, all thermal expansion and mechanical settling. But this was different. This was purposeful. He set down his tea very carefully, as if sudden movements might spook whatever was making the noise. His mind raced through possibilities. Hull breach allowing debris inside. Highly unlikely. Malfunctioning maintenance drone, except the station didn't have maintenance drones. Space rats, which definitely weren't a thing, or something his imagination hadn't gotten weird enough to invent yet. The sound came again, closer this time. Lincoln grabbed a flashlight from the emergency kit, feeling ridiculous and terrified in equal measure. He moved toward the maintenance access panel, each step careful and measured. The panel was standard issue, designed for easy removal during repairs. He gripped the release lever, took a breath, and pulled. The panel swung open to reveal darkness and ductwork and absolutely nothing else. Hello? His voice echoed in the confined space. This is your captain speaking. Well, not captain, senior technician. Only technician. Look, the point is, if you're a figment of my deteriorating mental health, please have the courtesy to be more dramatic about it. Silence answered him, the kind of silence that felt like it was holding its breath. Lincoln swept the flashlight beam through the tunnel, catching glimpses of pipes and conduits and shadows that moved wrong. He was about to write the whole thing off as stress and bad tea when the beam caught something that definitely shouldn't be there. A scrap of fabric snagged on a bolt, pale material that wasn't standard issue anything. He stared at it for a long moment. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, that's new. In the darkness beyond his light, pressed flat against the tunnel wall 20 meters away, Arya held perfectly still and cursed her carelessness in 7 different languages. She'd been getting sloppy, too comfortable in her routines. And now he was looking, really looking, and it was only a matter of time before looking became finding. Lincoln spent the next 3 days hunting a ghost, which was a significant improvement over his previous hobby of slowly going insane from boredom. He'd taken to carrying the flashlight everywhere, spinning around at random moments like a man auditioning for a paranoid thriller. The station's AI had diplomatically suggested he might benefit from reviewing the psychological wellness protocols, which Lincoln had interpreted as the computer's polite way of saying he'd lost it. I haven't lost anything, he informed the bathroom mirror while brushing his teeth. I found something. There's a difference. The mirror, showing him a man with wild hair and wilder eyes, seemed skeptical. He'd started mapping his search systematically, checking sections of the maintenance tunnels he normally ignored because they were boring, and also involved crawling through spaces designed for people smaller and more flexible than him. He found dust that had been disturbed, scuff marks on surfaces that should have been pristine, and once, gloriously vindictively, a half-eaten nutrient bar wrapper wedged behind a power coupling. Aha! He'd shouted into the empty tunnel, startling himself with his own volume. Evidence! Physical, tangible evidence that I'm not completely unhinged. The tunnel had absorbed his triumph with indifference. He set up motion sensors in the corridors he suspected were being used, jury-rigging them from spare parts and optimistic thinking. They triggered constantly, responding to air currents and thermal fluctuations, and possibly his own desperate need for validation. He reviewed camera feeds frame by frame, looking for anomalies, for shadows that moved wrong, for any sign that he wasn't alone. And he found nothing, which somehow made it worse. On the 4th night, Lincoln sat in the observation deck with a drink he'd synthesized specifically to be stronger than regulations recommended, watching stars that didn't care about his problems. He'd started talking to himself again, but this time with an audience in mind. Look, he said to the empty room, I know you're here. I don't know who you are or what you want, but I know you exist. The fabric doesn't lie. The missing food doesn't lie. My relocated coffee mug definitely doesn't lie, because that mug is too lazy to move itself. Silence answered, but it felt different somehow. Less empty, more occupied. I'm not mad, he continued, which was exactly what someone who was mad would say. Okay, I'm a little mad. 5 years alone will do that. But I'm not mad about you being here. I'm just confused about why you're hiding. This station is rated for 5 people. There's room, there's food, there's... He gestured vaguely at the viewport. Absolutely nothing else for 100 light years, so it's not like you have better options. He waited, half expecting a response, fully expecting nothing. I make terrible coffee, he offered, but I'm good at fixing things, and I know 47 jokes about quantum mechanics, only 3 of which are funny. Those are my credentials, in case you were wondering. More silence. Lincoln sighed and took another sip of his inadvisable drink. What he couldn't see was Arya, pressed against the wall in the corridor outside, her heart hammering in her chest hard enough that she worried he might hear it through the bulkhead. Her ears were flat against her skull, every muscle tense. He knew. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough, and she was out of options for staying hidden. She could run deeper into the station, find new hiding places, restart the game. But to what end? Another 5 years of living in the walls? Another 5 years of watching him talk to himself? Of wanting to answer and knowing she couldn't? The sensible thing was to stay hidden. The sensible thing had kept her alive this long. But Arya had been sensible for a very long time, and it had left her alone in the dark. listening to a lonely man offer friendship to someone who might not exist. She stepped into the doorway. Lincoln was mid-sip when he saw her, and the drink went down the wrong pipe in a way that would have been embarrassing if he hadn't been too shocked to care about dignity. He coughed, sputtered, and stared at the figure in the doorway with eyes that couldn't quite process what they were seeing. She was pale, luminously so, her skin seeming to catch and hold the dim lighting of the observation deck. But that wasn't what froze him in place. It was her ears, long and delicately pointed, swept back against her head in an expression he couldn't read but somehow understood meant nervousness. They stared at each other across the space of the observation deck, neither moving, neither speaking. Lincoln's brain was doing calculations it wasn't qualified for, trying to reconcile impossible with standing right there. Finally, he managed to speak. His voice came out hoarse from the coughing. "Are you the one who's been moving my mug?" The question hung in the air, absurd and earnest. Arya blinked, her ears twitching forward slightly, and then she laughed, a sound like crystal chimes, bright and startled and completely genuine. The tension shattered like glass. "Yes," she said, her voice uncertain from disuse. "I'm sorry about the mug." Lincoln made tea because it seemed like the thing to do when an alien woman materialized in your observation deck and admitted to relocating your personal property. The synthesizer produced 2 cups of something that approximated chamomile with the enthusiasm of a machine fulfilling a contract it hadn't read carefully, and he carried them to the small table where Arya perched on the edge of a chair like she might need to run at any moment. "Fair warning," he said, setting a cup in front of her. "This tastes like someone explained the concept of flowers to a computer that was only half listening." She wrapped her hands around the cup, her pale fingers absorbing its warmth, and took a cautious sip. Her ears, which Lincoln was trying very hard not to stare at, twitched in what he was learning to interpret as consideration. "I've had worse," she said. "I've been stealing your coffee substitute for 2 years." "I knew it." Lincoln sat down across from her, feeling vindicated and also mildly betrayed. "I knew I wasn't drinking that much, although in my defense, I was drinking quite a lot." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 people who'd lived in the same space for years without ever properly meeting, trying to figure out where to start. Arya's ears kept shifting, forward when she was curious, back when she was nervous, swiveling to track sounds in a way that was distracting and also oddly expressive. "So," Lincoln said finally, because someone had to, "you've been living in my walls." "In the maintenance tunnels," Arya corrected. "Technically." Right. Important distinction. Very different from walls." He took a sip of his terrible tea. "How long exactly?" 4 years, 7 months, approximately." Lincoln did the math, felt something break a little in his chest. "You've been here almost as long as I have." "I arrived 3 months after you." She was watching him carefully, her eyes startlingly human except for how they caught the light, tracking his reactions. "My ship was damaged. Stellar anomaly. My crew didn't make it." The words were matter of fact, but Lincoln heard what lived underneath them. He'd spent 5 years alone by choice. She'd spent nearly as long alone by necessity, hiding in the spaces between his awareness, mourning people he'd never known existed. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Arya's ears dipped slightly, acknowledging. "I intended to reveal myself, to ask for help, but the quarantine protocols..." She trailed off, shrugging. "It seemed safer to hide." "Safer than meeting me?" Lincoln tried to look offended. "I'm delightful. I have references. Well, I had references. 5 years ago. They're probably expired." That earned him a small smile. Barely there, but real. "You talk to your equipment." "My equipment appreciates good conversation. You argued with the coffee maker for 20 minutes last Tuesday." That was a philosophical debate about the nature of quality versus effort, and the coffee maker started it. Lincoln paused. "Also, you were watching that?" "I watch everything," Arya said it simply without apology. "The camera feeds, the sensor logs. I had to know your patterns to avoid detection. I know you check the Eastern Atmospheric Processor every morning at 0700. I know you sing off-key when you're calibrating the quantum relays. I know you do a small dance when you successfully repair something complicated." Lincoln felt heat creep up his neck. That's not dancing. That's expressing joy through movement. You did it for 3 minutes straight when you fixed the secondary coolant pump. It was a very good repair. They looked at each other across the table, and something shifted. The absurdity of it. 5 years, the same small station, living parallel lives that never intersected, was almost funny, almost tragic. Definitely something. I've been fixing things too, Arya admitted. Things you thought you fixed. The air recycler you checked last week. I'd already replaced the filter housing. You just tightened it. Lincoln stared at her. The recycler I spent 4 hours diagnosing. Yes, the one I wrote a very proud log entry about. I read the log entry. Her ears twitched in what might have been amusement. It was very thorough. I'm deleting that log entry. I made a copy. Lincoln laughed despite himself, the sound surprising in the quiet observation deck. You've been secretly maintaining my station, stealing my coffee, and archiving my technical incompetence. Anything else I should know? Arya was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Your ship, she said carefully. The one in the docking cradle. You think it's been in storage mode. It hasn't. I've been using its sensors to monitor for anomalies. In case... She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. In case whatever had destroyed her ship came back. In case she needed to run. Lincoln processed this, added it to the growing list of revelations. My ship has better sensors than the station systems. Significantly better. And you've been running a secondary monitoring network without me knowing. Yes, that's, he searched for the word. Actually really smart. Can I see the data? They spent the next week living in a strange new configuration of the same old space. Lincoln continued his routines, checking systems, logging data, drinking terrible coffee. But now Arya joined him, emerging from the shadows like she'd always been meant to be there. They fell into rhythms that felt simultaneously foreign and inevitable. Two people learning to share a station that had forgotten how to hold more than one. The ship became their project. Arya's vessel sat in the external docking cradle like a broken promise, its hull scarred from the stellar anomaly, its engines gutted and silent. Lincoln had passed it 1,000 times over the years, never knowing it held a story, never thinking to look closer. The core's completely fried, he said, floating in his maintenance suit outside the ship's engine compartment. Through his helmet, he could see Arya inside the station, watching through the observation port. But the housing is intact. If we cannibalize parts from the survey drones, reconfigure the power coupling. It would take months, Arya's voice crackled through his comm. Maybe longer. Good thing we're not going anywhere. Lincoln maneuvered closer, his magnetic boots gripping the hull. Question though, if we fix it, what then? You file this place as your forwarding address? There was a pause long enough that Lincoln wondered if the comm had cut out. Then Arya said, I've been thinking about that. Yeah? The station. It's rated for a crew of 5. Technically rated for a crew of 5, Lincoln corrected. Currently suffering under the management of one mediocre technician who argues with kitchen appliances. 2 technicians, Arya said quietly, if the paperwork was filed correctly. Lincoln stopped what he was doing, floating in the void with a wrench in his hand and a thought crystallizing in his mind. You want to stay. I want to not hide. Her voice was careful, feeling out the words. There's a difference. He looked through the observation port at her pale figure framed against the station lights. Her ears tilted forward in an expression he'd learned meant hope mixed with uncertainty. 5 years he'd been alone by choice, convinced that solitude was simpler than connection. And here was someone who'd been alone by necessity, offering to make the choice mutual. The bureaucracy would be a nightmare, he said, thinking out loud. Explaining why there's been an unregistered person living here for almost 5 years. The reports, the justifications, the probable investigation. Yes. And explaining you, no offense, an alien species that Frontier Command probably doesn't have protocols for. Also, yes. Lots of forms, really tedious forms, the kind that ask the same question 17 different ways. Lincoln, I'm just saying, it would be easier to fix the ship, let you leave, and I go back to my peaceful, lonely, slowly maddening existence. He paused. Easier, but significantly more stupid. Through the port, he saw her ears perk up. Stupid? Catastrophically stupid. The kind of stupid they write cautionary tales about. He activated his suit thrusters, heading back toward the airlock. We fix the ship, yes, but we keep it as a backup. Emergency transport. And we file the paperwork late and apologetic and buried in enough technical justifications that whoever reads it gets bored and approves it just to make it go away. That would work? Probably not. But I've been filing reports to people who don't read them for 5 years. I'm willing to bet they'll keep not reading them. The airlock cycled, pressure equalizing with a hiss that Lincoln had learned to find comforting. He pulled off his helmet as the inner door opened, and Arya was there, waiting. Her ears were fully forward now, her expression something that might have been relief, or might have been joy, or might have been both. "You're sure?" she asked. "I'm sure that I spent 5 years thinking I wanted to be alone, and I was wrong. I'm sure that you've been fixing my mistakes and moving my mug and making this station run better than it ever did with just me. I'm sure that your terrible sense of humor matches mine almost perfectly." He grinned. "Plus, someone needs to appreciate my quantum mechanics jokes. Only 3 of them are funny. See? You were paying attention." They walked together through the corridors toward the command module, past the recycler that ran smoothly now that 2 people were maintaining it, past the supply room where the inventory finally made sense. Lincoln pulled up the communication console, staring at the message template that would take 6 weeks to reach anyone who might care. "How do we even start this?" he asked. Arya leaned over his shoulder, close enough that he could see her considering, her ears tilting thoughtfully. "Personnel addition request, delayed filing due to extenuating circumstances." Extenuating circumstances? That's good. Vague but official sounding. Lincoln started typing, his fingers finding the rhythm. "Requesting approval for research partnership, 2-person crew, specialist in covert systems monitoring and long-term survival operations." You're making me sound qualified. You've lived in maintenance tunnels for 5 years without getting caught. You're extremely qualified. He kept typing, adding technical justifications and sensor data and references to protocols that probably existed somewhere. The message grew, bureaucratic and boring and perfect. They sent it into the void, 6 weeks toward people who might read it, might approve it, might send back questions they'd answer with more boring technical detail until everyone involved forgot why they cared. That night they sat in the observation deck with synthesized drinks that tasted slightly less terrible than usual, watching stars that seemed less distant than before. Lincoln's coffee mug, the sacred vessel, sat between them on the table, finally staying where it was put. "Galaxy's okayest technician," Arya read aloud, her accent making the words sound almost dignified. "Plural now," Lincoln said. "Galaxy's okayest technicians." Her ears twitched in amusement. "We'll need another mug. We'll need a lot of things. New routines, actual conversations instead of me talking to equipment. Maybe some furniture for your quarters that isn't salvaged from storage." "I like my salvaged furniture." "Of course you do. You lived in a wall." He smiled at her, this person who'd been a ghost and was now solid and real in here. "Thank you, by the way." "For what?" "For moving my mug. For fixing things. For not leaving when you could have." He raised his cup in a toast. "For making okay significantly better." Arya lifted her own cup, crystal chiming against composite. "To better," she agreed. Outside, the stars turned in their ancient patterns. Inside, the station hummed its familiar song, no longer empty, no longer alone. 2 people who'd thought they understood solitude learned instead about the unexpected mathematics of companionship. How 1 + 1 could equal something larger than both. How loneliness shared became something else entirely. The story wasn't ending. It was just finally beginning. The end. We've reached the end of Lincoln and Arya's story. If this story touched you, if it made you think about loneliness and connection in new ways, I would love